Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, hi. Welcome at the AUB Archaeological Museum. So today, yes, good evening. Thank you for being here. So today, I'm very happy to welcome with us Dr. Patricia Antaki, who is the director of the Department of Archaeology and Museology at the University of Balamand, and an associate professor as well at UOB and at Alba, which is a part of Balamand. She's a specialist in medieval archaeology of Lebanon and the region. Her fields of interest are urban topographies, fortifications, religious buildings, and materials such as sundials, bread stamps, mason's marks, and whatnot. Without further ado, Patricia, I give you the floor.
So good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me well? Yes? Okay, so can you hear me in the back? No? Yes, I have. Battery? It's working? Okay. So good evening, everyone. That's better, right? So thank you, Nadine, for this generous introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm very pleased to see you all. Lots of familiar faces, friends, colleagues, students, professors, friends of the AUB Museum, and some people who have come from northern Lebanon too. So thank you for being here. My gratitude also extends to all of the teams who have worked in Anfeh for the last 13 years, I think we can say, not only in Anfeh, but also in the neighborhood, under the direction of Nadine and within the Department of Archaeology and Museology of the University of Balamand. It's really thanks to all these hard workers that all the archaeological remains have been uncovered and studied, thus allowing us today to better understand the history of this coastal northern town that is Anfeh, which was still really on the eve of the excavations. I think we can say that its history was almost completely unknown. And on a personal level, it's always a pleasure to be in this place because it's really in this room that my personal archaeological adventure started a long time ago. The last time I was exactly here was in 2014. It was April 2014, so it was really exactly a decade ago. And at that time, Dr. Badr had invited me to give a lecture on Crusader Beirut. So here I am again, one more time, very excited to tell you the story of another Crusader town, and that is Anfeh. Now, I know a lot of you know Anfeh, have visited it, or at least have heard of it. And if not, well, I hope this is a good opportunity for you to learn more about it, and I hope a good incentive to go and visit Anfeh. So my presentation today will address two facets of the Crusader history of Anfeh, the war period and the peace period. So I will focus firstly on the battles and the wars that really shook literally the grounds of Anfeh and the lives of its inhabitants. And secondly, I will highlight some of the daily activities that the people of Anfeh would indulge into during the peace periods. And in both cases, we will be looking at both types of evidence that we have, the historical one and the archaeological one. So without further ado, again, let's embark on this tale, a tale of war and peace. So, just a very quick presentation for those who don't know Anfeh. So it's located on the north, on the coast, some 15 kilometers south of Tripoli. It sits, as you can see, on a fertile plain planted with olive groves. To the south, it's bordered by the towns of Shekka and of El Heri and the huge promontory of Ras El Sha'a, which used to be known in antiquity as the face of God, the Theoprosopon. And in the medieval sources, it is known as, in the Western sources, as Le Puits du Connétable, that is the well of the constable being an officer in charge of the cavalry. And in the Arabic sources, it was known under Wajh al-Hajar, the face of stone. So this is to the south, and to the north, Anfeh is delimited by a cape, which corresponds to the area called Al-Harayshe, where you have the monastery of Deir al-Natur, Sayyidat al-Natur, Our Lady of the Guard, which stands here surrounded by a lovely landscape of salt pans. As you know, salt is used to be one of the important productions of Anfeh during a large part of the 20th century. And it stopped during the war, and now there's an attempt to revive this important economic activity. Okay, and to the east, so you have the first hills that lead to the higher Mount Lebanon range. So now, if we look closer at the town, you can see this very curious geological feature, which is what we call as Ras al-Ala, which is the head of the fortress, literally. And it's actually a long, rocky peninsula, which is about 400 meters long, 100 meters wide, and some 12 meters high above sea level. And it's probably this feature that gave Anfeh its name, since it really looks like a nose in the middle of the face. Well, you'll tell me it's a long nose, but it's probably that. And it's the place, really, it's our playground where, because it's devoid of any construction, so this is where the excavations have taken place mostly. Now, this feature also acts as a protection against the southwestern winds. So this is why you have in red, you can see it's where the actual fisherman's harbor is located, squeezed between the resorts. And here is Taht al-Rih, the Greek-like village that you might know, where people enjoy nautical activities. But curiously, the town did not develop to the north, but to the south of the peninsula. Before delving into our main topic about the Crusader period, it's important to know that human presence in Anfeh is already attested long before this period. Indeed, Anfeh and its region show, as you can see, an occupation since prehistoric times, from the Neolithic to, the lower Paleolithic to the Neolithic periods. And you can see that these are the areas which have yielded all this, a part of the not flint tools, but flint material, let's say. Then we move to the Bronze Age period, represented mainly by a large quantity of potsherds and possibly some architectural features that are still being studied. And this is actually the period when Anfeh appears for the first time in historical literature in the 14th century BC, in the famous Tell al-Amarna letters, which are the correspondence between the kings of this region and the pharaohs. So Anfeh is cited 6 times by the king of Byblos, Rib Hadi, under the name Ambi. And this is how we learn that Anfeh was a port city, it was under the rule of Amurru, and it had turned against Byblos. In the Iron Age, that is the Phoenician period, Anfeh is mentioned only once in the 7th century BC in the annals of Asarhaddon, the Assyrian king, as one of the cities he had conquered or pretended conquering. However, almost no evidence has been recorded yet as dating back to this period, with the exception of some water tanks inside the Tarih site and a few potsherds on the peninsula itself. We also have virtually no remnants from the Hellenistic nor the Roman period, aside a few potsherds. The picture changes completely about the 5th and 6th centuries AD, so we're getting closer to the medieval period, where ceramic material was retrieved from various sites. But most importantly, so all the violet dots here, the peninsula and Saïd al-Tarih, so Saïd al-Tarih is here, have revealed abundant remains, namely a network of cisterns, of water reservoirs, several mosaic pavements, and some features seemingly linked to an artisanal production, installation, still to be determined. Now, what happens next, and what we learn from Arab historians, is that in the 7th century, the town of Anfeh, as it appears in the text, so for the first time we have really the name Anfeh, was part of the coastal cities conquered by the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah, and that it was under the direct control of Tripoli. And it will stay like this during all of the early Islamic period, that's from the 7th to the 11th century. Then, who appear over the horizon in the year 1099? Well, of course, the Crusader armies. After their departure from France and Europe in 1096, they arrive in our lands in 1099, but it's only after their capture of Jerusalem in July of this same year that they settle in the region following their conquest of Tripoli in 1109. And although the sources are silent on the capture of Anfeh, we can reasonably assume that they took it on their path and integrated to the county of Tripoli, which was one of their administrative regions. So you have the county of Tripoli, you have to the south the kingdom of Jerusalem, Principality of Antioch, and farther north you have the county of Edessa. So these were the four main administrative regions during the Crusader period. And we know that it was then a seigneury or a lordship, which was called Nefin, since several texts mention the names of the lords who governed it for a long period. All were members of a French illustrious family from the Provence region, and it was the family, the Renoir family. So we're going to see now what are the chapters in the Crusader history of Anfeh when battles took place there and when war was raging. So there are actually only two battles which are fully described with some fairly interesting details. The first one happened in 1205. So two historical accounts, one in Old French and one in Old Italian, record the following story. So I'm going to make it a bit short because it's very long. So what happened is that the Lord of Nefin, Renoir, married the daughter of the Lord of Jabal Akkar without the consent of the Count of Tripoli, Bohemond IV, who was his suzerain, his chief, let's say. Bohemond was not pleased at all and asked him to appear at his court. But the Lord of Nefin refused, and so Bohemond ordered him to hand over his fiefs or his properties. Violent battles followed between the two, each bringing his own allies to help. And in July 1205, with the support of the Genoese and with the help of 3 galleys and 400 fighters, Bohemond successfully besieged the castle of Nefin and destroyed it and took his vassal prisoner. The story does not end here, since in exchange for his freedom, as expected, Renoir had to renounce his fief and cede it to Bohemond. He was further punished, as you can see, by Bohemond, who blinded him in a cruel manner. I'll leave you the reading. It's interesting to know that Bohemond himself was one-eyed. Il était borgne. So, very ugly revenge. The second fight or battle, even more dramatic than the first, lasted for 7 years, from 1276 until 1282. Again, one of the protagonists was on one side the Count of Tripoli, at that time not Bohemond IV, but Bohemond VII. However, in the opposing camp this time stood the Templar Knights, guided by their Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, and their allies, the Lords of Byblos. Because, as you can imagine, quarrels and fight were indeed not uncommon between all these different Crusader entities. The first time in 1276, a knight named Paul de Feha, accompanied by 12 Templars, managed to enter the castle, but the troop quickly found itself trapped and taken prisoner. And the second time, in 1278, 3 of the 13 Templar galleys which had gone to Tripoli to attack it were forced to find refuge in Anfeh due to a sudden storm. And we know from the text that only the crews were saved by their comrades, who were then in the middle of a blockade against the fortress of Anfeh. But we have no further details on this attack. Finally, we know that on February 26, 1282, the fortress served as a tomb for those who had betrayed the Prince Bohemond. He had indeed succeeded in capturing several of his opponents, Guy de Giblet, that is of Speel, and members of his family. He placed them in a pit in the castle, maybe one of the cisterns, and left them to perish of starvation. In parallel with these quarrels, we see, and we always have when we dig there this, I don't know, Nadine, but we always think about these people who died there in a pit. In parallel with these quarrels, we see Anfeh and its territory appearing in 1281 among the places included in the peace treaty established between the Mamluk Sultan Kalaun and Bohemond VII, in renewal of an earlier truce concluded in 1275 by Baybars and the Count. Then comes the final blow, which followed the conquest of Tripoli by the same Kalaun in 1289. Indeed, in less than 2 months after the Mamluk victory in Tripoli, all fortresses and towns had fallen into his hands. And according to the sources, this happened in Anfeh without any resistance. The Syrian geographer Al-Dimashqi states that, I quote, in the space of 47 days, he recaptured from the Christian the fortresses of Jbel, Anfeh, Batroun, and Sarafand. So we had a fortress in Sarafand. And the Italian geographer Marino Sanuto relates that, I quote, a few days after conquering Tripoli and at little cost, the Sultan accepted Nefin's surrender and ordered its destruction, unquote. It seems that the Mamluks dismantled most of the fortress, since we know that there was a brief attempt to rebuild it 10 years later by some crusaders who were hoping to recapture Tripoli without much success. The place was abandoned and will reappear much later on in the Ottoman period sources as a modest village. Now, because of this war period people were living in, there was definitely an absolute need for protection. And how did they protect themselves? Of course, by using several means of defense. So the first defense line, well, one would encounter in towns of this period is, of course, the city wall. A usually solid and high rampart enclosing the town, which purpose was to prevent the enemy from entering the area, or at least making him think twice before an attack. So think, for example, of the wall preserved in the town of Byblos. You all know the city wall of Byblos, even though, of course, even if it's medieval, it has been the subject of several modifications over the centuries. Now, unfortunately, in Anfeh, no such feature has survived, according to my knowledge, at least. Can we then suppose that there was no town, but only a fortress, as we will see in a while? This hypothesis must be rejected immediately, as remains from this period can still be seen in the present town, such as the chapel of Sayyidat al-Rih, here, the church of St. Catherine, the church of St. Simon and Michael, and possibly also another one demolished not very long time ago and dedicated to St. George. Also, we have here some houses close to St. Catherine surrounding a courtyard, which seem also to be of Frankish or Crusader origin. So as you see, we do have several surviving buildings from that era. In addition, Anfeh is mentioned in the sources as being a town and not only as having a fortress. But the fate of this defensive enclosure that you can maybe try to imagine in this area, the fate of this enclosure seems to have been the same as that of other towns, such as the ancient medieval city wall of Beirut, which, however, had been recorded while it was being demolished at the turn of the 20th century, unlike the one in Anfeh. I should also evoke here two mentions which might hint at the presence of a city wall. These can be found in the writings of two visitors, the Arab geographer Al-Dimashqi and the German pilgrim Wilbrand d'Oldenburg, who both state that the town was well fortified, but there is a possibility that they could be referring to the fortress and not the walled city. In any case, I think that in this case, we have to apply the adage which states that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So the second feature after the city wall, which ensured the protection of a town, was its citadel, or fortress, if you like, usually composed of massive walls and towers and housing the town garrison and sometimes its governor or the lord. And the citadel of Anfeh is very well known to us through the textual evidence and the archaeological one. So first, the textual evidence. The pilgrims have mentioned the fortress. Those who have mentioned the fortress are the famous Arab geographer Al-Idrisi in the 12th century, whoever speaks, he doesn't say Anfeh, he says Anfeh al-Hajar. So he might be confusing the name with Wajh al-Hajar of Ras al-Sha'a. And the second pilgrim is the French bishop of Acre, Jacques de Vitry, who also only mentions the fortress. And finally, the German monk, Burkhard of Mount Sion, describes at the end of the century a fortress entirely built in the sea, and he accounts for the presence of 12 towers or 20 towers, according to another version of the manuscript. The citadel also appears in the siege accounts that I have already mentioned. And incidentally, we gain from these documents some anecdotal details, like, for example, that the entrance was equipped, like in all respectable fortresses, with what we call a portcullis, une herse, the vertically closing gate. And it was used actually during this attack to trap 13 Templar knights who had succeeded in getting there with their horses, led by Paul Tefeha, if you remember the story. So if we turn now to the archaeological evidence, the most interesting one. Now, of course, you're going to see lots of, I put some illuminations from medieval manuscripts, which have nothing to do with Anfeh. I'm sorry to deceive. But I think they illustrate well the atmosphere and the topic. So if we turn to the archaeological evidence, we can see that it really supports the text and confirms that the fortress was a highly impressive and remarkable monument. This building was erected on the peninsula itself. So as you can easily notice, it's the ideal place for building a stronghold, as this location provided a highly defensive asset that the new occupants have wonderfully taken advantage of. So the fortress is definitely the feature that has impacted the site the most, although paradoxically, it can hardly be seen today. Indeed, it has almost completely vanished, and we are mainly left with its negative imprint on the ground and with very few masonry walls. But every season, we're uncovering more and more of these. This wall enclosed all of the peninsula in red. and was thus erected on the edges of its rocky base on the seaside and on the rocky platforms that overlook the moats. I'll talk about the moats in a minute, on the land side. So what are the remains that have survived? First, we have sections of the walls themselves. Obviously, these have been pinpointed in several areas and also at the western end of the peninsula here. You have this portion of the core of the wall, which still stands at a substantial height of about 6 meters. Fallen large blocks from this outer wall have also been detected in several places, especially inside the moats and even underwater, as you can see here. The walls are massive ones, some 3 meters thick. The outer facing is the most impressive one with ashlars, that is well-dressed stones that can reach about 174 by 106 centimeters, so they're really huge, and they are characterized by the typical bosses and drafted margins. These blocks have been extracted from the moats themselves, which also logically served as quarries and where extraction marks are still visible. The infill, the core here and here, the core of these walls is made of rubble and mortar of red color usually, and the inner wall facing, so you might guess this one here, is made of medium-sized ashlars. And if we look closer at them, we can, but I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of these, we can observe the presence of mason marks. In this case, these were used as accounting marks used in the management and supervision of the construction work. Each mark would be engraved by the stone cutters as their personal signature that allowed the maître d'œuvre, the master builder, to pay each worker at the end of the day according to the number of stones he has cut. The second type of evidence we have pointing to the initial presence of the outer wall is the rock preparation. So that is the cuts which were set to receive the first courses, the foundation of the wall. These linear negative imprints can be observed in several places all over the edge of the peninsula, but they're not always very clear. It's hard to tell if it's for the wall of the fortress, because the peninsula has been occupied since the Bronze Age period. So as far as the towers are concerned, if you remember, one of the travelers, the pilgrims, talked about 12 or maybe 20 towers. Their presence can be inferred by some of the rock traces as well. Here you can see, for example, these two parallel walls, which might hint also to the presence of a tower here, and which must have served in defending even more the second access to the fortress. So now the moats. So as you see, the fortress remains a test to its strength and solidity. However, it could still be attacked and therefore needed further protection itself. From the seaside, it had these huge and high walls and towers defending it, but what about the area connecting it to the land side? So as you have already noticed, in this place, not one, not two, but 3 huge trenches have been dug in the rock across the peninsula. These are the moats that are the most impressive features of the site. And this is really quite exceptional and extraordinary in the architectural landscape of Crusader military places. The two only other towns I know about in the region, at least, where we find 3 moats are Tyre and Nicaea, present-day Iznik in Turkey. But the thing is that the moats are only visible in Anfeh. They have disappeared there. So the first moat, the most conspicuous feature of the site, is the most regular one. The second hasn't been fully excavated yet, and the third and westernmost is still almost completely filled. So we only have its borders. These moats are cut into the solid limestone rock and are about 70 meters long, a measure which corresponds to the width of the peninsula at this place. They are some 10 meters wide, and they are cut at sea level, which of course hints to their possible use as water-filled moats, as this picture makes it more than obvious. Such use of moats is recorded elsewhere in Tyre, in Tartus, Caesarea, Betchan, and possibly Atlit. As one might expect, in order to cross these spaces, a timber bridge must have been necessary, as is the case in the castle of Sahyun, if you know it, Alat Salah ad-Din in Syria, which still retains the pier, the stone needle that carried the bridge. Here also we are fortunate to have such a feature, although only in the first moat. You can see it here, it's about 5 meters high, a much more modest one than Sahyun's needle, which is about 28 meters high. An interesting feature related to the second moat was discovered during our latest excavations 2 years ago, and that was a long stairway connecting the second moat with an inner space which was used to access the moat. It is pierced in the massive external wall and is made of 2 parallel walls, a series of steps descending eastwards, covered by a vault that goes down parallel to the steps. It has 2 entrances. One is set in the upper part, and it's this one, and the other one is in the moat, and we haven't finished uncovering the other entrance. And finally, one of the most, finally for the war period, one of the most amazing discoveries that we made is a huge set of a very particular type of artifacts related to the defense of the place, and which are not very common in the typical archaeological record and are therefore fairly interesting. These are the stone projectiles that were used in battles. These are spheres with diameters here ranging from 30 to 60 centimeters. Such catapult balls have been detected on various sites by both crusaders, were used by both Crusader and Muslim armies, such as we can find them in Tripoli, in Sidon, in Lebanon, in the Crac des Chevaliers, in Sahyun, in Syria, where some can reach 300 kilograms. They have also been recorded in other parts, in Ajloun, in Jordan, and in several fortresses in Palestine, such as Al-Sur, Montfort, Acre, and Ascalon. These missiles were usually employed in the most powerful siege engines of that time, the famous trebuchet, called in Arabic manjaniq. Such devices are known, so here you have an illumination illustrating a Crusader manuscript. So here you have the traction trebuchet, which is a simple one, and there you have a replica of what is known as a counterweight trebuchet, which is much more elaborate, as you can see. They are known to have been used in several battles by both the besiegers and by the defenders, but more usually by the besiegers. In Tripoli, for example, we know that 19 of them were used by the Mamluks, and in Shif Arnoun or Beaufort, Baibars used in 1268 26 of them to storm the castle. In Anfeh, both siege accounts that we have referred to do not allude to the use of these machines. So we still don't know if they were actually part of the castle ammunition or if they helped destroying the castle walls, as most of them have been found embedded on the rampart located east of the third moat in a single place. So is it possible that they were used by the Mamluks to destroy the fortress, or they were part of the ammunition? We still have to dig further this issue. And now, so I would like to show you how this trebuchet worked. So I'm going to take you to the battlefield so that you feel a little bit the atmosphere of these battles. I'm going to show you just a minute of an excerpt of the movie, I don't know if you've seen it, Kingdom of Heaven, which accounts, it's the third crusade actually. And what we're going to see is the attack, is Saladin, who has just defeated the Crusaders during the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Now he's trying to capture Jerusalem, and he's going to succeed in doing so. So we're going to see just a minute of this battle, which is wonderfully done. So on one side, you will see Saladin and his troops, and inside the castle defending the Jerusalem, inside the city, you will see Balian d'Ibelin, played by the very handsome Orlando Bloom. And you will see how these machines work. So you will see the trebuchet and also the siege towers, the archers, the crossbowmen, etc. So I hope the sound will be okay. Now, of course, it's very exaggerated. All right. So this gives you an idea of how powerful the trebuchet was. It was really the most powerful siege engine before the advent later on of gunpowder. Right. So now we move to the second part of our tale, to the peace period, which was, after all, the main prevailing one, as you can imagine, only to be interrupted here and there by some attacks and sieges, which were directed mainly, as we have seen, towards the fortress. So what can we tell about the lives of the inhabitants of Anfeh at that time? From the evidence we have, our information is related to two fields, the industrial one and the religious one. Starting with the industrial activities that were carried out in Anfeh, we can mention four of them. First, the oil production, which comes as no surprise, of course, in an area with planted with, still until now, with olive groves. I have found so far only one textual evidence for this period in a charter established in 1135 and mentioning a donation granted by a Genoese lady, Adèle, widow of Hugues Embriaco, Lord of Schweil, to the canons of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. And this grant consisted of an annual income of 12 bezants, or the gold coin, the gold dinar, or 120 liters of oil to be levied from the city of Nefin. So that's the only textual evidence we have for oil. However, on the archaeological side, we're much more lucky. Of special significance was the discovery of oil presses. 3 complete ones can be found on the peninsula and close to it, without mentioning the numerous press elements that are scattered throughout the peninsula, and even in the town, some are used as spolia, as reused stones in the walls. Now, the problem with these is that they could be of an earlier date. Indeed, 2 of the complete ones are from the Byzantine period, that's 5th and 6th centuries, but seem to have been reused in the medieval period as indicated by the uncovered material. These 2 lie on the northern side of the peninsula and are exactly alike. They consist of a room completely or partially carved into the bedrock. They comprise each a crushing basin. Here it has disappeared. And in the middle and on either side, you have the 2 pressing surfaces. These pressing surfaces have been identified thanks to the presence of the circular pressing beds here and there, and their connected basins. We also note the presence of 2 niches where the wooden beam would be anchored, as well as counterweights used to lower the lever beam. A larger third niche in the middle had certainly another function, a store place or an oratory. In addition to these elements, a large cistern lies immediately below the bottom, below the back hole. Its presence can be explained easily as we know that every step of the oil extraction needs a large quantity of water. This one was the one found by Aimé. In case you haven't seen her, she's here. The oil press of the medieval period is of a different type of the lever and screw press, of the lever and screw type. It stands just behind the large defensive wall which overlooks the second moat and is comprised between this wall and another parallel one. So it is this one here. It also contains a crushing basin, as you can see in the middle, with its crushing basalt stone still in it. And it all, again, here we have two pressing areas on both sides, located symmetrically to the crushing basin, but so here and here. But here, the wooden beams were moved by means of a screw instead inserted in a large block, what we call the screw weight. The pressing beds have disappeared here, but we have found the two collecting beds set in the ground, although not in a very good state. However, the fame of Anfeh was not due to its oil production only, but also to a more appealing liquid, and that is wine. Indeed, 13th century visitors praised the good quality of the wine of Anfeh and of its neighborhood. A German pilgrim, Wilbrand d'Oldenburg, states that the fertile area around the town gives very good wines, which are very famous. And another one, Burkhard of Mount Sion, notes that the wine of this town is the best of the whole region. The vineyards of Neffin and those of Jbel, are also cited in a legal text from the Assize of Jerusalem, which is a law code, as an example of a land that the owner could cede for plowing. So what about the archaeological evidence? The excavations have indeed yielded wine jars recognizable by their hole at the bottom of their neck. The study of their fabric has, however, revealed that they were imported from Beirut, but it seems that a second fabric was produced locally. The presence of a third type of production can also be suggested, and this is the production of pottery. First, we have several kiln bars, which were used as a support for vessels, which have been found in several places in the peninsula and outside of it, as well as what we call the tripod stilts, which were used as spacers and were also therefore part of the kiln's furniture. So you can see even here the trace of the foot of one of these tools. And secondly, we have what we call biscuit-fired bowls, which are attested, and this is kind of pottery wasters. And the last evidence we have for the presence of a pottery workshop is that a local ware, local fabric, seems to be fairly common among the ceramic material. So, speaking of pottery, this is a map that shows you all the excavated and surveyed sites which yielded medieval and mostly 13th century ceramic material. The bulk of the material, which was retrieved from the peninsula, also belongs to the 13th century, with very few vessels dating to the Fatimid period and others to the Mamluk period. So basically, we find tableware, mostly consisting in glazed vessels. These comprise monochromes, polychromes, as well as what we call the sgraffito decoration. The repertoire includes plates, bowls, jugs, and table amphorae. Most of them were either imported from Beirut, as we said, or from other places, such as St. John of Acre, Elmina, or Port St. Simeon in Antiochia, Cyprus, Constantinople, as we found some what we know as Zosippus ware, the Aegean, and Italy, as attested by a ware called Proto-Maiolica. Some of these spots display a wide variety of motifs, like this lovely lady and this probably cat, which was finished by our ceramologist, Iruzi. So among the common ware, we also find a variety of shapes too, amphorae, jars, lids, and pitoi, Cookingware is essentially made of cooking pots and frying pans originating from Beirut workshops once again, and in most cases the pots are glazed from the inside. So this gives you an idea of the vessels used by the people at that time, whether to prepare food, to eat, to store, or to transport food. We can also suggest a last possible production, and that's the production of sugar. This is no surprise, since the whole Tripolitan region was known at that period for its sugarcane plantations and for its sugar refineries throughout the medieval period, since the 11th century, so even before the Crusaders arrived, up until the 15th century. And this is actually the first place where the Crusaders discovered with great pleasure the sugarcane, which was a completely exotic and familiar plant for them, as they used honey as a sweetening agent. And so they introduced it in Europe under the name canamel, can amiel, honey of cane. In Anfeh, we can possibly infer the presence of a sugar refinery through the presence, although in very few numbers, of these specific vessels, which were used during the final stage of sugar process. These are the conical sugar molds, which are pierced at the base and were placed on top of the molasses jar. So the boiled syrup of sugarcane was poured in the upper container, where it crystallized by dripping in the lower one. All of these commodities, oil, wine, sugar, and pottery, were sold in the markets and bought with coins, of which we have found only 2 types, and very few of them, since our excavations took place mainly in the fortress area, which is not really a marketplace. So until we find the treasure room, we must be satisfied with these. Both were struck under Raymond III of Tripoli at the end of the 12th century. One bears a gateway with an inscription Civitas on the obverse, and St. Andrew Cross Pomete, this is how it's called, which means terminated with kind of bubbles, with an annulate center and crescents in angles with the inscription Tripolis on the reverse. So this one is known as the Castle Copper type. And the second one bears an 8-pointed stars and a tower, which was not very visible, so I did not put it here, on the other side. The tower is in all likelihood a simplification of the stronghold of Tripoli that you all know. So during peace periods, people could also accomplish their religious rituals in a peaceful manner. In Anfeh itself and its neighborhood, there were various places which could receive the Christian worshippers, chapels, churches, monasteries. The ones which we can surely assign to the Crusader period are the following. So the St. Catherine Church, which displays the typical Western Romanesque features that you can identify just by observing its lovely facade. You can see the door ornated with the typical molded arches, and on top a notable rose window flanked by 2 slate-pointed arched windows. A somewhat curious engraving can also be seen on the south wall of the church, and it is a sundial, the simplest kind of sundial, which is typical of that period and very frequent in the churches of Western Europe. So I don't know if you have any idea of how it works. So there's supposed to be a tiny hole here, and you would place a stick, which we call the gnomon, in this hole, and you fix it. And then as the sun moves in the sky, the gnomon casts its shadow on the flat surface of the sundial. And so the people need only to read the line on which the shadow is to know what time it is. But it's only prayer time, because it's not very accurate sundial. This is why it's also called in English the scratch dial. We'll see another one in a minute. So is this a church that appears in one of the documents? So there's a document which talks of a church, but I think I don't have time to mention this. So another church is the also lovely Sayyidat al-Rih, Our Lady of the Winds Chapel, which was excavated by Nadine and her team in 2011 and 2012. It was built actually on top of a Byzantine chapel. The plan is very simple, barrel vaulted nave, semicircular apse, and to the west, a kind of narthex covered by a drawing vault. But the real treasure of this building are its mural paintings, which have been lately consolidated. And they depict several scenes, a daisies in the apse and on the lateral walls, the sacrifice of Isaac, theories of saints, a bishop, a holy rider, St. George or St. Theodore, we don't know yet. And in the entrance area, apostles on the vault and a scene of the Last Judgment on the south wall. We also have the Church of St. Simon and Michael next to St. Catherine Church, which has been rebuilt in the Ottoman period, but which keeps traces betraying Frankish origins and maybe even older phases. Other possible probable churches or chapels are the following: Mar Edna, Sayyidat al-Kharayib, the ancient church of St. George, which has been replaced lately by the new one, St. John the Baptist Monastery, the chapel of Deir el-Ahmar in Shreb'a, and surely many others that we hope to investigate one day. In addition to these, we can safely assume that there certainly was a chapel inside the castle itself to serve the needs of its residents, as it was usually the case. Such examples can be observed in Tripoli, in the sea castle of Sidon, the castle of Beaufort, for example, and we know from the text there was such a chapel in the castle of Tyre, just to mention the Lebanese examples. Now, if you look at the close surroundings of Anfeh, we also find the following monuments: the rock shelter of Saint Marina in Kalamoun, the monastery of Balamand and its sundial, with here you have the names of the prayers. So the monastery, which was founded by a Cistercian community in the 12th century, and which has really the original traditional architectural plan of a Western monastery. Finally, the Church of Saint Barbara, Saint Barb in Barron, which is also a typical Crusader chapel with a very beautiful fresco. So here you see one of the two angels that flank the Virgin Mary, which is in the middle of the vault. It's the site that we are currently excavating. So to wrap up the religious chapter, I would like to present two types of objects that were found. A common material found inside churches are the oil lamps, and of course outside churches too. The ones we found are from the 12th and 13th century type, the saucer type. And the second type is usually assigned to the Mamluk period. And we found it in the fill, Nadine found it in the fill of the cisterns in Sayyidat al-Rih. And finally, I would like to show you a peculiar object that was worn by the pilgrims and is still used until today. And these are the scallop shells, the coquilles Saint-Jacques. We have found 6 of them, which are pierced like this one. They are easy to identify as protective badges that were worn by pilgrims who had been in Santiago of Compostela, of course, the burial place of St. James, which was one of the most important pilgrimage destinations at that time. They were either worn around the neck of pilgrims or attached to their clothing, such as their tunic, their hats, or in this case, their purse. These objects were believed to ensure protection and to provide their owner with benefits, such as safe passage, room, and board, and it was probably also believed that they provided their owner some of the attributes of the saint. Pilgrims used to visit Jerusalem and the Holy Land also, as pilgrimage was widespread at that time, and they likely stopped for some reason in Anfeh, maybe to visit one of its churches. So other similar shells also were found in other places on some Palestinian sites. As a conclusion, this tale of war and peace, which took us back in time to Nefin, this modest lordship of the county of Tripoli, illustrates what most cities at that time had to endure in times of war and how they protected themselves with city walls, fortresses, and moats. This tale also gave us an insight on how the dwellers of these towns lived during most of the time by accomplishing their religious duties in the various worship places, from rock shelter oratories to churches and monasteries, and by indulging into several economic industrial activities in their workshops, such as oil and pottery production, but possibly also wine and sugar. with a varied ceramic material reflecting a substantial trade taking place with close and faraway regions. But the questions remain numerous, as only 5% of the 3.3 hectares of the peninsula only surface has been investigated, despite the considerable amount of work that has been already achieved so far. Our adventure in search of Anfeh past, as you have guessed, is still at its threshold. And since we're talking about war and peace, and in order to have the pleasure of contradicting Leo Tolstoy himself in this context, of course, and by distorting a little bit the meaning of his saying in his famous War and Peace masterpiece, and the saying goes, all we can know is that we know nothing, and that's the highest degree of human wisdom. So I hope that contrary to this, you know much more now about Crusader Anfeh than you did when you arrived. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Antaki, for this brilliant presentation and very lively one. Any questions? We left time for questions.
It wasn't clear in the presentation whether the dwellings at that period were all inside the walls, behind the walls, or were there dwellings outside the walls as well?
This is an excellent question. I showed you, maybe you didn't notice at the beginning, next to St. Catherine, there's a cluster of houses which really smell Crusader period. I think they're Crusaders. So I'm sure there were houses outside, but we have mainly focused on the peninsula excavations.
How many inhabitants were there at that period? Inside?
Question, I'm prepared for this.
Are you prepared for it? Good.
So actually to have some parallels, the largest city at that time was the harbor city, the port city of Acre, St. John of Acre, and it had 40,000 inhabitants. Now, a small, thriving port city like Caesarea, which was not far from Jerusalem compared to Anfeh, had 5,000 inhabitants. So we're talking much more less than 5,000, I think, in Anfeh. Like maybe 1,000 or two.
But you mean the garrison could be what, 100, 200 soldiers? The garrison.
The garrison, at least, yes, yes. Maybe in times of war, people would gather and in the fortress. So there would be, it really depends on the period. It's like in Tyre, after the defeat of the Crusaders in the Battle of Hattin, everybody gathered in Tyre. And Tyre remained the only town which was not, that Saladin could not conquer. So it really depends on the year, on the time.
One last question. There was a supply of water inside the nose? Supply of water?
Yes, we have cisterns.
Cistern? No springs.
I didn't mention, we found one from the Byzantine, built one from the medieval period. But Byzantine period, lots of them.
So it was cisterns, not springs.
Sorry?
No natural springs, only cistern?
Cistern. So they would gather the rainwater. Of course,
Thank you.
The main issue is the water.
But if it might help, in the water, we have some fresh water. In the sea, yes, we have identified several ones. Any other questions? Yes.
Firstly, I would like to thank you for the marvelous work you have done. Additionally, you have mentioned the production of oil and wine. You didn't mention the salt marshes, which is very important in Anfeh. Can you shed, please, some light on its historical aspects?
Okay, I don't want to disappoint everybody. It's my personal opinion. Maybe it's not Nadine's one, who knows the subject much better than I. But I've made a small research, and I think Mr. Hayek in the back too. I found that there might have been salt extraction. We have no textual evidence for it, and it's very hard to tell on the ground if a basin is to date a basin, today's rock cut features. However, from the text, it appears that until the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, I haven't found any text related to an Anfeh extraction of salt. And they used to bring salt from Cyprus. I found mentions from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century of imports of salt from Cyprus, from Larnaca mainly, during the Ottoman period. And in antiquity, we know that Cyprus, I think, also had some salt marshes and industries, but nothing appears for this period in Lebanon. Yes. Yes.
Writer at the end of the 13th century mentioning the salt production, not production. He said there are salt extraction areas before Tripoli. He says before Tripoli, they are situated before Tripoli on the coast at the end of the 13th century. Now, his name, but it is in my book. I speak of the, and another thing, why didn't you mention Deir el-Natur as a medieval, it is a medieval monastery, convent, Deir el-Natur, for many, many aspects. The bell tower, which is similar to Balaman's bell tower, the oculus of the facade, a lot of features.
Good question, because I've studied Deir el-Natur stone by stone, and for me it's completely Ottoman. All the Crusader features are either recent or even the text, which the Mother Superior said that we know when it was built, she took it from Balamand, actually, and it was the text concerning Balamand. So for me, except those very Cistercian-like windows, which are very recent, it's all Ottoman. And I suggested we make a sounding, but the building, the masonry, does not appear in the text.
I don't agree with you at all, really.
Thank you very much. So you see, we know very little. There was a question here.
On en reparlera.
Just, you mentioned the monastery of St. John, but there is a lot of, when I visited it, there is a lot of archaeological remains, and it seems that there is a lot of pieces from different people.
Yeah. I haven't studied.
You didn't.
So of course there's an oil press, if I'm not mistaken. There are lots of features. There is a hypogeum under the altar, which is from the.
Yeah, and the sister there have remains of pottery, a lot of pottery also. She collected pottery.
We haven't finished exploring, definitely. Sheikh Nadine.
And
finished exploring and
the second question is about the curved basins that are located south, so close to the cement factories. They are, I don't know, local guides talk about them as remains from basins to collect the salt from Canaanite even and Phoenician periods. But they are curved, but did you do any datation or no?
Not yet. We know that indeed we can trace back salt production to the 16th, 17th century, but nothing earlier so far in terms of evidence, archaeological evidence. This doesn't mean that it did not happen. I mean, all references around the Mediterranean tell you that such features that, as Dr. Antaki precised, that are rock cut are very difficult to date. We can date when you saw these huge cisterns, because we have there many layers over the centuries, and we can trace at least, we call it an antequem and a postquem dating. We can have some kind of dating, but when you have such shallow features that are cut directly in the rock that are still in use today, all the archaeological evidence has been erased many, many times. But this does not mean, as you very well said in your own lecture, this doesn't mean that they do not date back to much earlier periods. It's just that we don't have neither the literature or the material to prove it. But we do have oral history, and oral history definitely traces it back to the early Ottoman period so far.
Half a question and half a comment regarding the conflict between Tripoli and Anfi. Beside being a personal problem between the two princes, the Prince of Tripoli and the Count of Anfi, it was an outcome of a much greater conflict that poisoned the relationships of all the coastal towns at the Crusader time. And that goes back to the Genovese and Venetian conflict. It's well documented in the writings of Grousset. And that was an outcome of that. And Jbeil and Anfi on one side then. And the destruction of Anfi came before the Mamluks at the hands of the Crusaders themselves. I think that Gérard Ridfort or Belfort did that destruction first, and then it was rebuilt and destructed.
Sources, so that would be interesting to check it out. Thank you.
Anyone has a more question? No? Then we invite you to join us for a reception at the museum.